The sun hung lazily over the Florida coast that morning, casting a warm glow across the manicured lawns of Mar-a-Lago. Inside a grand sitting room, the former American president sat in his usual spot, remote in one hand, a half-read newspaper in the other. The television was cycling through channels like a roulette wheel of world affairs, each segment more forgettable than the last. Then something caught his eye. It wasn't the footage of tanks rolling through deserts or talking heads bickering over domestic policy. It was a speech, calm, poised, sharp like a scalpel. A young man stood before a cheering crowd somewhere on the African continent, dressed not in the stiff uniform of old dictatorships, but in a simple suit, speaking to his people with a blend of warmth and conviction. The chyron beneath him read, "President Ibrahim Trrowé, a new vision for Africa." The former president furrowed his brow. He leaned forward slightly. "Who is this kid?" he muttered. It wasn't the first time he'd heard the name, but this was the first time it felt like a presence. Trrowé's words weren't just political slogans. They carried intention. He spoke of sovereignty, of development, of fairness on the world stage. It wasn't angry or radical. It was persuasive, grounded, and delivered with a confidence that felt dangerous to old narratives. To some, Trrowé was a beacon of youthful leadership. To others, especially those invested in the old world order, he was a disruption, a reminder that influence was no longer a birthright. Back in Florida, the former president, once a businessman, then a head of state, felt a flicker of irritation. "He's getting too much attention," he said, tossing the newspaper aside. "People are acting like this guy reinvented leadership. Somebody needs to put him in his place." Around him, his aides exchanged quiet glances. One of them, a young press secretary, hesitated before speaking. "He's quite popular internationally, very composed. Harvard cited his economic model last month." That only made the former president more determined. He rose from his chair. "Set it up," he said. "A live debate. No edits, no filters, just me and him. I'll show the world what leadership really looks like." It sounded like a challenge born of pride, not policy. The room tensed slightly. "Sir," another aide ventured, "Trrowé is. Well, he's sharp, extremely well briefed." "It might be. I've built an empire," the man cut in. "I ran the biggest economy in the world. This guy runs a country the size of a shopping mall. Trust me, I've got this." Thousands of miles away, on a quiet hilltop overlooking the capital of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Trrowé read the debate invitation in silence. He closed the folder gently and looked out the window at the bustling streets below markets opening. Children in uniform on their way to school. Vendors calling out the day's specials. The heartbeat of his country was steady, but he knew this was more than just a media opportunity. "This isn't about me," he said softly to his foreign minister. "This is about something much deeper. About the way the world still sees us." He stood and faced his team. "Accept the invitation. But if we do this, we do it right. I want a full dossier, everything from trade policies to development indexes. I want to understand not just his administration, but his worldview." There was no bravado in his tone, just focus, precision. His staff moved quickly. Economists, historians, diplomats, and even young policy interns were assembled. Trrowé worked long hours, studying not only the history of American policy, but also the psychological tactics of televised debate. He wasn't preparing to win an argument. He was preparing to protect the dignity of something far greater, an entire generation of African leadership finding its voice. News of the debate spread like wildfire. Media outlets framed it as a clash of eras, a showdown between an icon of old-school Western power and a rising voice from the global South. Commentators speculated endlessly. Would this be a train wreck? A turning point? A mere publicity stunt? Around the world, people took sides. Some saw it as entertainment. Others saw it as history in the making. But in the heart of Burkina Faso, something deeper stirred. In villages and cities, in schools and marketplaces, people weren't cheering for drama. They were hoping for dignity. They knew what was at stake. Not just reputation, respect. As May 29th drew near, the stage was set. Two leaders from opposite ends of the political spectrum. Two very different styles. One stage, 1 hour, and the entire world watching. What started as a stunt was about to become something much bigger than anyone imagined. Not a debate between two men, but a mirror held up to the very idea of leadership itself. The announcement of the debate hit global headlines like a thunderclap. It wasn't just news, it was theater. The kind that makes anchors speak in hushed tones and universities cancel lectures so students could tune in. It was everywhere. Cable news, podcasts, social media, and dinner tables from Johannesburg to Jakarta. But while the world buzzed with anticipation, two very different preparations were quietly unfolding. In the heart of Burkinasu, behind the modest gates of the presidential complex, Ibrahim Trrowé was building something that looked less like a media campaign and more like a war room of ideas. There were no flashy rehearsals, no grandstanding, no trial runs in front of cameras. Just a team of thinkers, young and old, local and global, gathered in quiet rooms, poring over reports, data sets, and decades of international policy. Trrowé's strategy was simple. Don't argue opinions, present facts. He had once said, if you speak with truth and clarity, you don't need to shout. And that became the spirit of his preparation. He read everything: trade statistics, historical treaties, climate data, even transcripts of past debates involving his opponent. He wasn't interested in scoring points. He wanted to build a moral compass, a roadmap, and hold it steady in front of the world. His advisors were astonished by his discipline. One aide recalled walking past the president's office at midnight and seeing him still awake, not reviewing talking points, but watching a documentary on infrastructure development in Southeast Asia. I want to understand how others did it, he explained. What worked, what didn't. Because if this debate becomes just a clash of egos, we all lose. Meanwhile, on the coast of Florida, the former U.S. president took a different approach. He held meetings, yes. He asked for memos, certainly. But there was no deep study, no late nights fueled by policy reports or economic briefs. His confidence was a fortress, built not on preparation, but on reputation. I don't need to study him, he told his media advisor with a grin. I've been in boardrooms longer than he's been alive. His team pushed back gently. They offered briefing books, fact sheets, even summaries of African Union policies. But they rarely made it past the first page. He's from a country no one can pronounce, he said, half laughing. This is going to be easy. To him, the debate was a show, a performance, a chance to reclaim the spotlight. And in performance, he believed, charisma and confidence would always outshine careful thought. Some in his inner circle were quietly concerned, but no one dared to say it too loudly. After all, he had won before with style over substance. Maybe this would be the same. Across the globe, anticipation swelled. College students organized watch parties. Diplomats cleared their schedules. African newspapers ran headlines like, "Our voice on the world stage," while American outlets posed questions like, "Can he still command the room?" But in Burkinasu, something else was happening. It wasn't hype. It was pride. For a country too often spoken of only in terms of poverty or struggle, this was a rare chance to be something else. A standard bearer of dignity, intellect, and calm resolve. Not just for Burkinasu, but for every underestimated voice across the global south. People began sewing flags. Schools hung up posters of their president next to historical leaders. A young poet in the capital published a verse titled, "Speak soft, carry wisdom." It went viral across the continent. Trrowé, for all his humility, felt the weight. But he bore it not with fear, only clarity. Back in Florida, the former president was rallying with his usual bravado. He did a short interview with a major network, grinning confidently into the camera. He's going to see what real leadership looks like, he declared. I built skyscrapers. He builds speeches. Some laughed. Some winced. The world had heard confidence before. Now it was waiting to hear content. And so the day drew near. In a quiet moment, on the eve of the debate, President Trrowé stood alone at the balcony of his residence. The stars over Burkinasu flickered like quiet prayers. Below, the capital city breathed gently. He wasn't rehearsing lines. He wasn't calculating attacks. He was simply remembering. The farmers he'd visited who asked for roads, not rhetoric. The teachers who worked without books but still changed lives. The widows who raised entire families on nothing but courage. He wasn't just walking into a televised debate. He was walking in carrying all of them. And when the cameras rolled the next day, it wouldn't be about volume or dominance. It would be about something quieter, something deeper. The kind of leadership that listens before it speaks. The world held its breath. May 29th, 2025. New York City. The studio lights inside the Fox Global Auditorium beamed down with clinical precision. Producers whispered into headsets. Microphones were checked, cameras aligned, countdowns whispered in 3 different languages. Outside, the streets were sealed. Inside, history was quietly preparing to happen. And then the doors opened. 2 men walked out onto the stage. On the left, the former American president. Tall, broad-shouldered in his signature suit and red tie. A wave of confidence, a smile that said he'd already won. He raised his hand to the audience with the flair of a man used to applause. On the right, President Ibrahim Trrowé. Slim, composed. His navy blue suit crisp but modest. He nodded once toward the crowd. No wave, no dramatics, just presence, calm and complete. The moderator welcomed them, her voice steady. "This is not a debate of ideologies, but of leadership," she said. "Tonight we ask, what does the world need now?" The clock began. The former president struck first. His voice carried the weight of years in business and politics. "Let's be honest," he began. "Experience matters. I ran the world's largest economy. I negotiated with superpowers. Mr. Trrowé may be a promising young man, but leading a nation like his, it's not the same as leading the free world." He smirked as the studio chuckled politely. But Trrowé didn't flinch. "Leadership," he replied, "is not about the size of your economy, but the size of your responsibility to those you serve." He leaned forward slightly. "When I took office, my country had 60% of its people living below the poverty line. Today, it's 26%. Not because we are rich, but because we made healthcare free, built roads with our own engineers, and grew food with our own hands." The moderator blinked. The audience leaned in. The American president pivoted quickly. "Numbers can be twisted, but let's talk real power. Our military, our markets, our influence, these are the tools that shape the world." Trrowé nodded, slowly. "And yet," he said, "your last administration saw influence decline in 60 countries. Meanwhile, regional trade in my part of the world increased by over 300%. Influence is not imposed. It's earned." There was no anger in his voice, just math, just memory. The debate moved to foreign policy. The former president tried a different tactic. "You came to power in a way many questioned," he said. "Careful not to say too much. Are you really in a position to lecture on democracy?" A few in the room tensed. But Trrowé simply said, "We restored constitutional order within 18 months, and we've since held 3 peaceful elections with 89% voter turnout. That's democracy, not theory." Then softly, "Leadership is not perfection. It's correction." The studio grew quiet. As the clock ticked on, the contrast became clearer. One man measured strength in past titles. The other measured it in future potential. One raised his voice. The other raised the standard. At one point, the moderator posed a simple question. "What does the world's future look like to you?" The American president painted a familiar picture. Strong borders, booming stock markets, factories roaring again. Trrowé spoke of something else. He described children learning under mango trees because schools were full. Of farmers selling millet to countries that once gave them aid. Of women starting businesses with $50 and changing entire villages. And then he said, "The future belongs not to those who dominate, but to those who develop." That line would be quoted on every news channel for weeks. Some moments were lighter. When asked what books inspired them, the American president cited The Art of the Deal, Trrowé, mentioned Long Walk to Freedom and Things Fall Apart. Different shelves, one commentator joked later, but the same aisle. Influence. But the turning point came near the end. The former president, clearly frustrated by Trrowé's calm and clarity, reached for an old trope. "Let's face it," he said. "Africa has always struggled with leadership." There was a hush. No anger crossed Trrowé's face. No defensiveness. Instead, he smiled gently. "Every continent has struggled," he said. But while Africa ended apartheid without war, while Ghana changed presidents peacefully 6 times, the United States is still debating voting rights. Then, softly again. Struggle isn't a shame. Stagnation is. The debate ended not with fireworks, but with a quiet awe. Trrowé didn't gloat. He simply offered a handshake. The former president hesitated for a moment, then accepted. As the lights dimmed, the crowd stood. It was not an ovation for theatrics. It was for truth, dignity, and a new kind of voice. That night, Trrowé returned to his hotel without fanfare. No parties, no statements. Just a single tweet: "We rise by lifting the truth." It went viral in 49 languages. The sun hadn't even risen in Asia when the first clips from the debate hit social media. By mid-morning, the world was wide awake. Across every platform, from YouTube and TikTok to BBC and Al Jazeera, highlights from the night before spread like wildfire. Not through scandal or outrage, but through curiosity. Something had happened, something people didn't expect. And it had a name: Ibrahim Trrowé. In London, the Financial Times ran a front-page piece titled, "The Power of Precision. Trrowé Redefines Diplomacy." In Tokyo, a political commentator on NHK said this wasn't a debate. It was a masterclass in grace under pressure. And in Paris, a stunned Emmanuel Macron was reportedly overheard telling aides, "This young man just lectured the West without raising his voice." In Washington, D.C., the reactions were less elegant. Cable networks scrambled. Headlines ranged from admiration to damage control. Trrowé overperforms, read one. Trump faces global critique after debate, said another. But underneath the noise, a shift was happening. Subtle but seismic. The world had seen something it wasn't used to. A leader who didn't shout, didn't boast, didn't interrupt, and yet somehow commanded every room he entered. Within 48 hours, public polling in the United States showed a dramatic drop in the former president's favorability, especially among younger voters. Even traditionally conservative outlets began airing replays of Trrowé's closing statement. "This isn't about winning," he had said. "It's about learning how to lead again." Meanwhile, universities across Europe and North America began citing the debate in international relations courses. At Harvard, a standing room-only seminar analyzed Trrowé's rhetorical style. One student wrote on the whiteboard, "Calm is power." Back in Burkina, a country that rarely made global headlines, celebrations erupted spontaneously. Not for revenge, not for bragging rights, but because, for the first time in decades, their story was being told by someone who didn't flinch when the spotlight came. Ibrahim Trrowé didn't give speeches that week. He visited hospitals, schools, farming collectives. "Let the world talk," he told aides. "We'll keep building." But the calls poured in. Invitations from the European Union, the African Union, the United Nations, think tanks, Nobel committees, universities, and one surprising caller, a bipartisan delegation from the U.S. Congress. They wanted to meet, not to argue, but to learn. A week later, a Sunday news show featured both a former speechwriter and a global economist breaking down why Trrowé's message resonated. "It wasn't just his stats or policies," said the economist. "It was his posture, his moral clarity." The speechwriter nodded. He did something rare. He told hard truths without sounding bitter. Meanwhile, Trrowé trended globally for 10 consecutive days, not for a scandal, but for a sentence. "Leadership is not perfection, it's correction." It was printed on T-shirts in Lagos, projected onto buildings in Berlin, quoted at a graduation speech in São Paulo. Across Africa, leaders watched closely, some with admiration, others with quiet discomfort. But young people were electrified. In Nairobi, university students formed a forum called the Trrowé Initiative to study leadership models rooted in empathy and integrity. In Lagos, a popular podcast aired a tribute episode titled "The Day Africa Spoke and the World Listened." And in Accra, a 12-year-old girl wrote a letter to her school principal asking why they had never studied Burkina Faso in class. Her letter was published in the national newspaper. Despite the global buzz, Trrowé refused to monetize the moment. He declined lucrative speaking tours, refused brand deals, and turned down an international book offer worth millions. Instead, he accepted one invitation: to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos. 6 months later, standing before a packed audience of heads of state, billionaires, and media moguls, Trrowé began. 6 months ago, A man challenged me to a debate. He thought it would be a lesson for me, but it became a lesson for all of us. He paused, then added, "Never confuse volume with value, or history with destiny." That speech received a 5-minute standing ovation, a first for an African leader at Davos. Back in the U.S., the former president's political prospects dimmed. His party, once divided, began to coalesce around new voices. Even his loyal base seemed unsure. A prominent strategist admitted on national television, "We were ready to fight another campaign, but now we're in a different conversation." And as America grappled with what leadership meant in a shifting world, something surprising happened. Government officials, quietly and without fanfare, reached out to Trrowé's office for advice on conflict resolution and intergovernmental dialogue. And he responded not as a victor, but as a partner. In December 2026, Ibrahim Trrowé was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, not for defeating anyone, but for redefining the rules of engagement, for proving that diplomacy didn't require dominance, just dignity. In his acceptance speech, he said, "I was underestimated because of where I come from, because of how I speak, because of my age. But that night, the world learned something. Respect isn't demanded. It's demonstrated. And the future isn't written by those who yell the loudest, but by those who build the quietest." The room stood. The applause was thunderous. But Trrowé just nodded, as always. Quiet. Grounded. Not because he had won, but because he had spoken, and the world had finally listened. By 2027, the term Trrowé moment had entered political vocabulary. In diplomatic circles, it described the precise instant a lesser-known figure seized global attention not by force or charisma alone, but through clarity, humility, and vision. And make no mistake, Burkina Faso's president had become a global reference point, not because he shouted, not because he postured, but because he listened, then spoke with a weight that couldn't be faked. A leadership model had quietly shifted, and the world noticed. In Africa, his influence deepened. He launched an initiative called Seeds of Sovereignty, a Pan-African educational reform program designed to reduce foreign dependence in curricula and nurture homegrown innovation. He insisted it wasn't about exclusion. "It's not anti-anything," he said at a summit in Kigali. "It's pro-us." Meanwhile, a technology partnership between several West African nations, dubbed Project Ubuntu, took root focused on developing digital infrastructure powered by solar grids and open-source platforms. When asked why the project bore no foreign sponsor tags, Trrowé simply smiled and said, "Sometimes you have to prove it can be done alone before you accept a partner." In Latin America, several younger politicians began quoting his Davos speech. In Scandinavia, a youth parliament adopted his quote, "Respect isn't demanded, it's demonstrated," as their annual theme. In Southeast Asia, a viral short film reimagined ancient village elders as future-focused leaders with Trrowé's tone and demeanor. In each case, his influence didn't come from conquest or campaigning. It came from resonance. One global news host summarized it like this: Trrowé didn't just represent a nation. He represented the idea that dignity is scalable. Back home, Trrowé kept his routine simple. Every Thursday, he visited a local school. Sometimes he gave short talks. Other times, he simply listened to what the students were learning. He preferred chalkboards to press conferences. In one class, a 10-year-old asked him, "Are you the most powerful man in Africa?" He laughed softly and replied, "Power isn't about how many people know your name. It's about how many people grow because you believed in them." That quote made its way onto posters in classrooms across 5 continents. Of course, fame didn't come without challenges. Security had to be heightened. His family endured relentless scrutiny. Misinformation campaigns tried to tarnish his record. But what unnerved critics most was that he refused to respond in anger. When asked by an interviewer if he was bothered by the attacks, he said, "There's a difference between being silent and being still. I am not silent. I'm just not shaken." His approval ratings remained among the highest globally for an elected leader. Not for perfection, but for consistency. In 2028, at a gathering of young global leaders in Cape Town, Trrowé delivered what many later called his New Humanity address. He didn't announce a grand plan. He didn't call for revolutions or reforms. Instead, he asked 3 questions. What would your country look like if every child believed they mattered? What would your leadership look like if you weren't afraid to lose power? What would the world look like if we measured success by who we lift, not what we own? Silence followed. Not out of confusion, but awe. One delegate from South Korea later said, "He asked us questions our textbooks never did." By 2030, Trrowé had become a mentor to dozens of emerging leaders across the globe. Not through hierarchy, but through letters, visits, and quiet counsel. He started a private fellowship program for civil servants from underrepresented nations. No cameras, no press releases, just results. When a journalist asked him why he chose that approach, he replied, "If the work is honest, it will echo." And it did. One fellow from the Pacific Islands later became their region's top climate negotiator. Another from Eastern Europe led judicial reforms in her country. All cited the same inspiration, not a man, but a method. Perhaps what made Trrowé so enduring wasn't what he achieved. It was what he made others believe they could achieve. In a decade defined by noise, he offered quiet. In a landscape of division, he embodied cohesion. And in an age obsessed with speed, he reminded people to slow down and think. He wasn't flawless. He admitted mistakes. He changed course when wrong. But through it all, he remained grounded in the belief that people, when treated with dignity, will rise. In 2031, during an address to the graduating class at Oxford University, he ended his speech not with a call to action, but with a reflection. He said, "My story isn't a blueprint. It's a breadcrumb. If it helps you find your way, wonderful. But never forget, the world doesn't need more Trrowés. It needs more yous, fully awake, unafraid, and ready to lead, not louder, but better." The crowd stood for nearly 7 minutes, not for a president, but for a promise. Today, you'll still find Ibrahim Trrowé quoted in speeches, classrooms, and articles. But ask him where he feels most alive, and he'll point to a quiet rural school with dusty windows and children learning in both French and more. There, without fanfare, the legacy continues not in history books, but in hope. And perhaps in that simple continuity lies the greatest shift of all.